Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Hamilton Galloway, and I'm the head of Consultancy for the Americas at Oxford Economics, a leader in global forecasting and quantitative analysis. Oxford Economics has conducted several economic impact studies, including those within the rail industry. A September 2018 study that Oxford did with the Rail Supply Institute found that the rail supply industry supports 650,000 mostly middle-income jobs, generates $74 billion in U.S. GDP, and touches every state. This sector also supports hundreds of producers of parts, components, and systems for the rail supply industry. Now, nested within this rail supply industry lies a sector that manufactures public transit and freight rail cars and rolling stock. This sector employs over 21,000 middle-class workers in the U.S. and supports nearly 190,000 jobs in the U.S. In other words, every job in the public transit and freight rail car and rolling stock manufacturing sector supports nearly 8 additional jobs in the U.S. economy. It is these jobs that are under threat by foreign state-owned enterprises. Foreign competition from SOEs is an increasing challenge for the U.S. economy because they operate with a different business model. Their core purpose is to fulfill a social or economic need in their own country's economy, but in recent decades, several SOEs have become multinational. SOEs pose a risk to us because they enjoy advantages like state direct subsidies, concessionary financing from state-owned banks, and regulatory exemptions. These anti-competitive practices displace private sector competitors, causing cascading negative effects upon business owners, workers, and families in the U.S. In 2017, Oxford Economics researched the potential disruption of SOEs in the U.S. freight railcar manufacturing sector. We found a pattern of anti-competitive behavior in countries outside the U.S. with respect to pricing. To cite one example, this led to the collapse of Australia's freight railcar manufacturing industry. And we concluded that if similar practices were to occur here in the U.S., they would threaten 65,000 American jobs. Under one worst-case scenario, if just $1 billion in freight railcar sales were lost to an SOE, nearly 13,000 jobs would be lost in the U.S. and $1.3 billion would be lost to U.S. GDP. The bulk of this loss would be felt across the supply chains of freight railcar manufacturing, recalling that these supply chains span every state in the Union. At Oxford, we recently turned our attention to passenger railcar manufacturing, a sector where SOEs already established operations in the U.S., including final assembly facilities. Although rail cars will be assembled here, a large number of the components are likely to be sourced from the SOE's home country, like China. We assess 2 scenarios of potential disruption. In the first scenario, the SOE does not need to adhere to federal Buy America provisions, which is currently set at 65% U.S. content, but will jump to 70% next year. In this scenario, we assume the municipality purchasing rail cars is not using federal funds. So much of the railcar content will actually be made in the SOE's home country. In our second scenario, we assume a good faith adherence to Buy America provisions, which applies when federal dollars are used. For context, local municipalities including Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Chicago have already awarded contracts to an SOE. 3 of these city contracts are entirely funded by state and local governments, so the Buy America provisions do not apply. In the non-Buy America scenario, over half of the railcar's value is lost overseas. This means that for every $1 billion in railcar productions by an SOE costs the U.S. more than 5,000 jobs and $500 million in GDP. Put another way, for every final assembly job created by an SOE here in the U.S., 5.4 jobs are lost elsewhere in the U.S. economy. In the Buy American scenario, more of the railcar's value is kept here in the U.S. However, we estimate that $1 billion in production awarded to an SOE still leads to a net loss of 3,200 jobs and a reduction of almost $320 million in U.S. GDP. In this scenario, every SOE final assembly job created still eliminates 3.5 jobs here in the U.S. economy. So ultimately, America loses in both scenarios. We just lose less under Buy America. Our research therefore suggests that anti-competitive practices by SOEs could destabilize competitive private sector railcar manufacturing, causing long-term consequences to productivity and efficiency. This creates cascading negative effects across the U.S. due to the loss of private sector jobs. In sum, it is imperative that policymakers promptly acknowledge, assess, and respond to the SOEs making headway in the U.S. rail industry to prevent the loss of thousands of jobs, as well as hundreds of millions in wages, GDP, and taxes. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering any of the questions.